Hi, today we're going to go over chapter 5 of a Savitch book. So the chapter 5 is function with all subtasks. So I broke it down to smaller sections. In this video, we're going to be talking about 5.1, that is void functions. And then I will go over the other ones with other videos. So basically, void functions are the functions that are returning nothing. Void means nothing in C++. So when we talked about the top-down design, we talked about taking the task for the whole program and break it down to subtasks. At the beginning with the program design, we call them modules, and then we call them subtasks, and now we call them functions. So we're going to have some functions that are going to return something, and we're going to have some functions that are not going to return something. So we can think about it like if I am displaying my output to the screen, this function is not going to return anything. So that's what we're talking about right now. So in general, when we have functions, we can have the function to return one value or more than one value. So we can have more than one thing that's going to return, or we can have it so we can have it for no value, one value, or more than one value. So one of the things that we can think about is when we're talking about the functions that don't have a return value, that would be a void function. Remember what we talked about in programming in general, and for the function in specific, we are talking about IPO. What is coming into it, what is going to be doing with it, and what is coming out of it. So we talked about it into our program, what's coming to our program, what is my program doing, what is going out of it. Now we're going to talk about the same IPO for the function. So when we are having a function, the question is what's coming into my function and what's going out of my function. So I like visual stuff, so I would do some drawing for the things that's going into my function and the things that's going out of my function. So I just make some drawing on it. So we're going to expand on this when we're talking about call by reference. So there is a possibility that I have a parameter that goes in and come out at the same time. I can have parameter that goes in and doesn't come out. That would be called by value. And we can have the function itself to return something. For C++, the function can only return one thing, just one thing. So we cannot return multiple things. Of course, when you go to the advanced topic and you learn about some other data structure, then you are going to be able to do some other stuff. But for now, we cannot return more than one thing. So if I have a function that's going to return one value, I can return it through the parameter. We talk about it next section, or I can return it as a function return value. If it is, and we worked on it in chapter 4, but if it has more than one value to return, then I cannot return it through my return value. I have to return it through my parameter, and that goes to next section. So the word keyword, the keyword void, we're going to put it at the beginning of the function. That's going to tell the compiler that this function is not returning anything. So when we have a return value, when we have a return statement, it doesn't have any value after it. I can omit this. So when it hits the right braces, it's automatically going to return. So I can have it here with no expression after it, or I can just leave it out and then the function is going to return. So remember about the function, when we call a function, it's going to jump to another location in the memory. You will learn more about this in the assembly class if you take that. And then it's going to execute the code for this function. And two things can happen. Either it's going to hit the return keyword, or it's going to hit the right braces, and it's going to return back to where it was called from. So that's the way it's going to be called. So let's look at some of these things. So if I have a void function on my declaration, we're going to have the keyword void, and we're going to put the comments. We talked about this. So your book is talking about precondition, postcondition. I'm sticking with my IPO. What is this function doing? What's coming into it? What's going out of it? And I want to stick with that because it's going to define how we can pass stuff to the function and get things back from the function. And of course, we're going to have our function definition. So both in function definition and function declaration, we need the word void at the beginning of it, meaning that these functions are not returning anything here. So when we worked on chapter 4, and chapter 4, we had return value functions. So when we have return value functions, which are my favorite, you can put it in the middle of expression. You can put it as a parameter of another function. You can put it as a condition for the switch statement. So you can actually put your function and you can treat it as a variable. Because when it returns a value, the whole function call is going to change with the value that's going to be replacing the whole thing. So the return value is going to replace it. But when we're doing the void does not return any value. So I can use the void by itself in a statement by itself, but I cannot do it in expression. Even I cannot do it in the cout. So this is not acceptable. Why? Because show result is a void function. It's not returning anything. And if it doesn't return anything, the cout doesn't know what to do with it. So that's the difference between a void function and a return value function. So you can put cout on a return value function, a square root, POW, or some of the functions we created in chapter 4, but you cannot do that with a void function. That's a big, huge area that we're going to be working on. So the function call is going to be almost the same as what we were doing before. So it doesn't matter what happens. The function call is going to be almost the same way. We have some argument for the void function that we can have. Our void function, if we can have functions with no parameters. Okay, so we can have void function that doesn't return anything, and I can have, so for example, in this case, if we're talking about the rand function, it doesn't take any parameters. So we can have functions that don't have any parameters. And of course, we can have void function with no parameter. This is for information only. Remember, our functions are going to do one thing and one thing only. So if it's nothing going into my function and nothing coming out of this function, the only thing this function can do is just display some messages on the screen. So you play a game before you start, or at the beginning of your game, it's going to display some rules and things that you need to do. It's going to explain about the game. So that's what we can do with a function that does not have any parameter and does not read does not return anything. So if I have a function that doesn't have any parameters and it doesn't return anything, it's only for information use. It's nothing else in there. So if something is happening in there, then we have to reconsider. So it goes into just like the other one. When you call a function, it's going to go to the body of the function. It's going to execute those statement that you have in the body. And we may or may not have a return in there. If we have a return, as soon as it sees the return, it's going to come back to where it was called. If it doesn't have a return, it's going to go all the way to the right braces, and then it's going to return. So even if I don't put any return in the body of the function, when it goes to the end of my function definition, it's going to come back. It's going to automatically return. Okay, let's look at some functions so we can move forward of how we're going to do this. So one of the things that we're talking over here. So we want to translate Fahrenheit to Celsius. Okay, so before we do that, I have a question for you. The question is, what is the problem with this formula? So if I put this formula inside of my function, I will receive 0 constantly. It's not going to give me a correct number. Do you see the problem? Do you see the problem if I take this one, put it in my C++? So remember, 5 divided by 9 is going to give me 0. And anything multiplied by 0 is going to give me 0. So this formula, if I put it in my function body, this function always going to return 0. So you have a function, you're testing it, and it's going to give you 0. You've got to go back and look at the division. So we can typecast it, or we just put a decimal point on one of them or both of them, and that way we can get the fraction and it's going to work. Now, next step is, what is, if I want to create a function, the description of this function is what? It's going to calculate Celsius based on the Fahrenheit. So calculate Celsius would be a good name for it. Your book decide to do a Celsius for the name of it. So that's the description that we're going to put it for the comments. Then the question is, what's coming into it and what's coming out of it? So Fahrenheit is what's coming into my function, and centigrade is the one that's coming out of it. So I have one thing going into my function, one thing coming out of it. So when we go to the next section and we learn about the call by reference, then we can move the return value somewhere else. But for now, the things that's coming into my function is going to be a parameter. So I'm going to have one parameter that's going to hold my Fahrenheit, and I'm going to have a return value that's going to be for my centigrade. Now, let's look at this. So remember that we are going to put our function declaration on the top. I still see some people putting function definition on the top. That is not acceptable for this book and for this class. We have to put the function declaration on the top. Function declaration with proper comments. So that's what we're going to be doing. So this function right here is a function that does not have any parameter and does not return anything. So nothing goes in it, nothing comes out of it. So if I have a factory that does not accept any raw material and it does not have any finished product, is it really a factory? Or it's just a building that we can describe it? So we can use this to put some description for our program. In this case, it's just putting ENDL, just goes to the next line, just give it a little separation. I use this one to explain about the program for the end user, not for the developers or other people, for the end users, some brief description of what's going on, what's expected, and those kind of things. In here, we have a return over here. To put that one in there or not doesn't make any difference. You put it here, as soon as it's going to see it, it's going to return. If it doesn't see it, it's going to hit the right braces and it's going to return automatic. So some of you start writing program, you're more comfortable to have that return over there because it's going to be similar to the previous chapter, but it does not have anything after it. That's for the void functions. Next function, we define it that it's going to return something. So that is a return value function, and it's going to have a Fahrenheit as a parameter. So one thing goes in, one thing comes out, and they are not the same thing. Then we're going to have our output. So we are going to put our output over here. Remember, for the output, I have two things going in it, but nothing coming out of it. When I'm doing the output, we're talking about data. We're not talking about display, okay? I'm not talking about the cout. I'm talking about what kind of a data coming out of it. So for me to be able to display my result, I'm going to need my Fahrenheit, I'm going to need my centigrade, and I'm going to display them. When I display them, there is no data coming out of it. So generally, rule of thumb, when I have an output function, that output function generally is a void function. We do not want to return anything from our output function. So that's for that one. Let me clear this out, and then we click to the next one to look at some of these things. So in here, we're talking about the Celsius that has a Fahrenheit going in and Celsius coming out, and the Celsius coming out is going to be a return value function that we can have expression after it. So we have this whole expression after it that's going to return, and when we call this, the function call is going to be replaced with the result of this, and we are putting 5.0 and 9.0 to be sure we get the decimal point and it's not integer divided by integer. Now, next one is going to be our show result. So I have F degree or Fahrenheit going in, C degrees going in, and nothing coming out. So that's for the show result. That's going to be my output. And another point here is we are putting our formatting into our output function. So in this class, we're moving forward that our main is going to be only function calls. So we're going to have input function, processing function, output function, and we are getting there. So right now, you know how to do your processing if it has one return value. You know how to do your output function with the void function. And we will learn how to do our input, because our input function can return more than one value. If it has only one value, we still can do it. But if it returns more than one value, that's something that we're going to learn next section. Okay, so we can have return a statement or we can omit it, but then sometimes we're going to need it. So there are going to be some times that in the middle of the function definition, I don't want to continue anymore. I want to get out. So as soon as hits this return, it's going to go back. That means it's not going to execute the rest of this stuff. So as soon as the C's return, it's going to go back. So all of these things are not going to be executed. So in this case, because we are worried about division by 0, if we see a number, remember, we always going to be verifying our numbers or inputs. So if for any reason somebody called this function with the number being 0, remember, we don't know where are these things coming from. We're going to protect our function as much as possible. Then we're going to return. So it's not going to do anything, it's just going to return. That way, it's going to avoid this division by 0 right here. So that's a good use of a return in the middle of it. Again, the return for the void function doesn't have anything after it. And you can see that we could potentially have a return value at the end here, and we can just not put it there. So putting a return value in line 14 or not putting it doesn't make any difference. So if you're more comfortable, you want to put the return value, return statement over there, that's fine. If you don't want to do it, that's fine too. So the main is actually a function. So you've been working with the main, you're starting with main, and you have your main program. So the main actually is a function, and it is supposed to be a void function, but it's not declared in places as a void function. And you can see that the return 0 can be omitted. So we just don't put it in there, and it should work. But still some compiler are requiring it. So my main is going to be int main. Traditionally, long time ago, when we were using C language and C++, and we were running these things in a command line, we were using the return of the main for error codes. So if the main would return 0, that means we didn't have any problem. But if it would return a number, that means somewhere inside the modules that we have, something went wrong. In the next course, you learn how to make multiple modules and one main as a project. So your project can have multiple files in it. So that was in real life, we had programs calling other programs, and then if something goes wrong, we would have it return an error. So you call tech support, you say, I see the code 2586, and the tech support is not actually a technical person. It's got a table. It goes and look up that number and I say, oh, put this file in this directory, you should be fine. Or do this one here, you should be fine. So every code is going to say what is the expected problem, and then that was the traditional way of the return value for the main. Right now, we're just going to put a return 0 and move on. This is going to be our activity for 5.1, and please take a look at it and be ready to discuss it in class. I'm going to stop right here.